Okay, this is answering scientific questions. Bittersweet. In 2007, scientists found they had a mystery on their hands. In some countries, commercial honeybees began dying off in very large numbers. Honeybees pollinate crops such as apples, nuts, celery, and squash. If the mystery went unsolved, basic foods might become scarce. Scientists began to investigate. In 2009, they compared the genes in healthy honeybees to the genes in sick honeybees. They found evidence that certain viruses attack proteins in honeybees. The afflicted bees seem unable to produce proteins that can fight the viruses, so the bees die. This study was one of the first to identify a cause for the mystery, but scientists still need to investigate further to find a cure for the sick bees. So, what is scientific inquiry? You hear a small whirring noise and look up. A ruby-throated hummingbird darts by, its wings a blur. It hovers over red salvia in the garden and then moves to an orange flower. It doesn't seem to go near any yellow flowers. What attracts a hummingbird to a flower? Do hummingbirds prefer some flower colors to others? Thinking and questioning in this way are the start of the scientific inquiry process. Scientific inquiry refers to the diverse ways in which scientists study the natural world and propose explanations based on the evidence they gather. So, posing questions. Scientific inquiry often begins with a question about an observation. Your observation about the hummingbird's feeding habits may lead you to ask a question. Do hummingbirds prefer red flowers to other flower colors? Questions come from your experiences, observations, and inferences. Curiosity plays a role too. Because others may have asked similar questions, you should do research to find what information is already known about the topic before you go on with your investigation. Look at Figure 1 to pose a scientific question about an observation. Developing a hypothesis. How could you answer your question about hummingbirds and flower color? In trying to answer the question, you are developing a hypothesis. A hypothesis, plural hypotheses, is a possible answer to a scientific question. In this case, you may suspect that hummingbirds can see red better than yellow. Your hypothesis would be that hummingbirds are more attracted to red flowers than yellow flowers. Use Figure 2 to practice developing a hypothesis. A hypothesis is not a fact. In science, a fact is an observation that has been confirmed repeatedly. For example, it is a fact that hummingbirds have tiny hairs on the tip of the tongue that help lap up nectar. A hypothesis, on the other hand, is one possible answer to a question. For example, perhaps the hummingbirds only seem to be feeding more red flowers because the garden has fewer other colors of flowers. In science, a hypothesis must be testable. Researchers must be able to carry out investigations and gather evidence that will either support or disprove the hypothesis. How do you design and conduct an experiment? After developing your hypothesis, you are ready to test it by designing an experiment. An experiment must follow sound scientific principles for its results to be valid. The experiment needs to produce the kind of data that can answer your question. Also, the data collected need to be measurable. For example, to find out if the hummingbirds have a color preference, you could set up red and yellow feeders to test from which color, if any, the birds prefer to get food. Then you could collect data by counting how often hummingbirds feed from both the red and yellow feeders. Controlling variables. To test your hypothesis, you will observe hummingbirds feeding from different colored feeders. All other variables, or factors that can change in an experiment, must be the same. This includes variables such as the type of food, the shape and size of the feeder, and even the time of day when you observe the hummingbirds. By keeping these variables the same, you will know that any difference in how often a hummingbird feeds is due to feeder color alone. The one variable that is purposely changed to test a hypothesis is the independent variable. The independent variable here is feeder color. The factor that may change in response to the independent variable is the dependent variable. The dependent variable here is the number of times the hummingbird visits a feeder. Setting up a controlled experiment. You can test your hypothesis in a controlled experiment. A controlled experiment is an experiment in which only one variable is changed at a time. You decide to test the hummingbirds at two different colored feeders, red and yellow. All other variables are kept the same. The feeders should be the same size, shape, and height above the ground. They should be in the same general area and contain the same amount and concentration of sugar water. The amount of time you observe the feeders should also be the same. Otherwise, your experiment would have more than one independent variable. Then you would have no way to tell which variable affected your results. Practice setting up a controlled experiment in Figure 3. Collecting and interpreting data. Before you begin your experiment, decide what observations you will make and what data you will collect. Data are the facts, figures, and other evidence gathered through qualitative and quantitative observations. For the hummingbird experiment, you set up one feeder of each color. You decide to conduct 3 observations or trials because hummingbirds may behave differently from one trial to the next. You also decide to observe the feeders for 15 minutes at the same time for 3 days and count the number of visits to each feeder in that time period. You can use Figure 4 to organize your hummingbird data. After your data have been collected, they need to be interpreted. One tool that can help you interpret data is a graph. Graphs can reveal patterns or trends in data. You can use different graphs to present different types of information. Bar graphs are useful for comparing values across categories or treatments. Line graphs are used to show data points over time. Pie charts can be used to show the contribution of each item to the whole. Drawing conclusions. Now you can draw conclusions about your hypothesis. A conclusion is a summary of what you have learned from an experiment. To draw your conclusion, you must examine your data objectively to see if they support your hypothesis. You must also consider if you collected enough data or if there's more than one interpretation for this set of data. In the case of the hummingbird's color preference, the data show that the red feeder had a greater average number of visits than the yellow feeder. Thus, the data support your hypothesis. Now you should repeat your experiment to see if you get the same results, as shown in Figure 5. A conclusion is unreliable if it comes from an experiment with results that cannot be repeated. Many trials are needed before a hypothesis can be accepted as true. In some cases, your data may not support your hypothesis. When this happens, check your experiment for things that went wrong or for improvements you can make. Then fix the problem and do the experiment again. If the experiment was done correctly the first time, your hypothesis was probably not correct. Propose a new hypothesis to test. Scientific inquiry usually doesn't end once an experiment is done. Often, one experiment leads to another. Communicating. Communicating is the sharing of ideas and results with others through writing and speaking. Scientists give talks at scientific meetings, exchange information on the internet, or publish articles in scientific journals to communicate. When scientists share the results of their research, they describe their procedures so that others can repeat their experiments. Scientists wait until an experiment has been repeated many times before accepting a result. This way, scientists know that the result is accurate. Therefore, scientists must keep accurate records of their methods and results. Before the results are published, other scientists review the experiment for sources of error, such as bias, faulty data interpretation, and faulty conclusions. This review process helps prevent unreliable results from being published. Sometimes, a scientific inquiry can be part of a huge project in which many scientists are working together around the world. On group projects, scientists share their ideas and results regularly. Figure 6 asks you to come up with ideas for communicating the results of your hummingbird experiment. What are scientific theories and laws? Have you ever had a theory that your friends were planning a surprise party for you? Everyday theories you might have are different from scientific theories. A scientific theory is a well-tested and widely accepted explanation of observations and experimental results. Scientists are constantly testing scientific theories. If new observations or experiments do not support a theory, then the theory is changed or thrown out. In a community, people make rules to help them live together. These rules are called laws. Science has laws too. A scientific law is a statement that describes what scientists expect to happen every time under a particular set of conditions. Scientific laws describe observed patterns in nature without trying to explain those patterns. For example, according to the law of gravity, all objects in the universe attract each other. Learn about another scientific law in Figure 7.